This green field in England is home to some of the oldest flying aircraft in the world. This is the Shuttleworth collection, antique machines from the 20s and 30s. Aeroplanes seemed a bit more fun and a bit more colourful in those days. They slip in and out of the tiny grass airfield with the greatest of ease. It's not so much an air show, it's more like watching village cricket. Among the Avros, the Hawkers and the Ryans, a historic aircraft for all Australians. It's the de Havilland Racing Comet of 1934, which won the air race from to Melbourne. By any definition, this is one of the great planes. In this program, we'll look at other classic aircraft in museums all over the world.
The Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, just north of London, has an astonishing collection of World War II aircraft, particularly German types, as well as fast jets and a great many historic aircraft that you'll see here and nowhere else.
One of the rarest types on display at Hendon is the Handley Page Halifax. This aircraft was recovered from a lake in Norway where it had been submerged for more than 30 years. Its geodetic construction, a type of basket weave of aluminium beams, was immensely strong. It could take a lot of punishment and still fly home. The Wellington and its Australian crew was featured in Target for Tonight, a British wartime propaganda film. The Wellington was in service at the outbreak of World War II and still in production at the end of it. In fact, they built more Wellingtons than any other British bomber type. It looks like a big Spitfire with the unmistakable shape of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, but this is the Boulton Paul Defiant, a turret-armed fighter, the only one in the world. The turret behind the pilot has 4.303 Browning machine guns. Unfortunately, the Defiant had no gun firing forward, something which German pilots took full advantage of. Australians flew the Gloucester Meteor in Korea, but very few pilots flew this version, the Prone Pilot Meteor. There are two cockpits. The front one contains a pilot sitting not upright but flat on his stomach. The idea was that a pilot lying flat would be less susceptible to G-forces in high G manoeuvres. The controls were duplicated and the pilot still worked the elevators and ailerons with the stick and the rudder pedals with his feet. But it was difficult for the pilot to escape in an emergency, and his vision was very restricted. An aircraft designed to fly very slowly, the Hunting 126, which used a technique of blown flaps. There are 16 nozzles arranged along the trailing edge of the wing, which were fed hot gases from the engine. The takeoff speed, a mere 52 kilometres an hour. From a small jet to a big piston-engined aircraft, this is the Lincoln, a development of the Lancaster bomber. Australia built the Lincoln under licence and flew them on bombing missions during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. This is the only complete Lincoln in the UK. The Supermarine Seagull, built to an Australian specification and designed by Reginald Mitchell, who also designed the Spitfire. They were designed to be flown off Navy cruisers, then land on the water before being recovered. After the war, this one ended up in civilian use in New Guinea and was to have been entered in the 1969 London-Sydney Air Race. Hendon has a fine collection of German World War II types. A Heinkel 111 medium bomber used in the Battle of Britain, a Junkers 88, a fine aircraft which served in many roles as a bomber, fighter and night fighter. An unusual two-seat version of the Focke-Wulf 190, the Butcher Bird. A Messerschmitt 110. The antenna on the nose is for the Liechtenstein airborne radar. And 2 jets, the all-wooden and dangerously unstable Heinkel Volksjager and the brilliant Messerschmitt 262. The de Havilland Museum north of London has many classic de Havilland types, including various bits and pieces of the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner, which first flew in 1949.
It was an instant success, ordered by most airlines of the world. Then, mysteriously, they started dropping out of the skies with depressing regularity. The problem was the fact that the plane had, like this one, square windows.
In 1954, a comet blew up over the island of Elba in Italy with the loss of all passengers and crew. The cause? Metal fatigue. A crack had appeared in the corner of one of the square cabin windows and under pressure spread rapidly. The aircraft disintegrated and plunged into the sea. A Comet fuselage was submerged in a water tank and fatigue tested until the cabin failed. When production of later versions of the Comet resumed, the aircraft had round windows. But by then, Britain's lead in building jet airliners had been lost, and even though the revamped Comet was a good aircraft, the damage had been done. A new player was on the scene, the Boeing 707. The first Boeing 707, the Dash 80, still exists, and it's on display at the Udvar-Hazy Center in Washington, D.C. When the Dash 80 was first rolled out of the factory in 1954, it was like a Hollywood film premiere. Boeing were keen to show the world that their new jet was made of strong stuff. So in front of a huge crowd, the test pilot put the airliner into a slow roll. And then he did it a second time. It's hard to believe that this rustic setting is home to one of the most famous aircraft of all time, the Mosquito. This country house at Salisbury Hall is where the very first Mosquito was built, and it's still here. The first of the wooden wonders is still painted in prototype yellow, although it's under restoration and minus its engines. During the war, de Havillands took over the hall and the Mosquito was assembled in great secrecy. Later, it was moved to Hatfield for its first flight. This was the first of more than 7,000 Mosquitoes, 200 of which were built at Bankstown in Sydney.
The Lightning, the first British aircraft to go supersonic in level flight. I got a soft spot for these. I went in one of these a long time ago, flying from Binbrook in Lincolnshire in England to the Norwegian coast in 8 minutes. It was probably the ride of my life. We did about 1,500 miles an hour. It's not surprising that the pilots who flew this aircraft often called it not the Lightning, but the Frightening.
The Lightning had a sensational performance and could climb to 50,000 feet in 1 minute. When I flew in the Lightning with the RAF in 1967, we went supersonic in the climb. Powered by two afterburning Rolls-Royce Avon engines, the Lightning could outperform just about anything. Today, the only Lightnings still flying are in South Africa, including the two-seater that I flew in. This futuristic building at Cosford in the English Midlands houses one of the most unusual collections of experimental aircraft of the 50s and 60s. There's the Saunders Roe SR-53, a plane with two engines. The top one, a rocket, the bottom one, a jet. The rocket motor was to be used in combat to make a high-speed dash, but the SR-53 was a long time in development, and the British government decided that the day of the manned fighter anyway was over. The pretty little Delta is the Fairey Delta II. Only two were ever built. And in 1956, the sister aircraft to this one raised the world's airspeed record to 1,132 miles an hour.
These impressions of its flying demonstration seem to indicate that it will do anything demanded of it.
Despite this, the British government showed no interest in developing the aircraft into a fighter. The French Dassault company, however, did. They armed it with guns and missiles, modified the nose to incorporate radar, and called it the Mirage. Everybody bought it, including Australia, and it went on to be the best-selling fighter aircraft of all time. This aircraft, the Bristol 188, was designed to go even faster.
The 188 was designed to do 3 times the speed of sound, but it never really reached its performance specifications. In fact, these two enormous de Havilland Gyron Junior engines were so powerful and so thirsty that the plane frequently had to be towed to the end of the runway before they started them. Flying the 188 was always a dangerous premise. It was supposed to do 1,800 miles an hour.
The 188 was made out of stainless steel, not aluminium, and welded, not riveted. The engines used so much fuel it was lucky to stay in the air for 30 minutes. It landed at 480 kilometres an hour, hence the enormous speed brakes. The 188 was purely experimental, its purpose to see how stainless steel would handle high temperatures. It was supposed to go faster than the Concorde. In fact, it had trouble reaching Mach 2, let alone Mach 3. Flying it was a terrifying prospect. It was always running on empty. The 188 was going nowhere, but the TSR-2 was a whole different ball game. A brilliant aeroplane, it could fly on the deck close to the speed of sound. Its job? To penetrate Soviet radar defences and drop a nuclear weapon. They've got some of those on display here too. A couple of bombs, atomic, general purpose. Two aircraft aircraft were up for grabs: the F-111 American and the TSR-2 British. If Australia had bought the TSR-2, the plane would probably have survived. These were difficult times, and in Indonesia, President Sukarno was threatening Northern Australia.
To sweeten the deal, the British said they would base a squadron of Vulcan bombers in Northern Australia to meet the Indonesian confrontation. As it happened, the TSR-2 project was scrapped, but it was an outstanding aircraft, and it's interesting to speculate what would have happened had it entered service.
Another Cold War bomber, the Vickers Valiant. This one painted all white to protect it from the heat flash of a nuclear explosion.
It was a Valiant that dropped Britain's first atomic bomb at Maralinga in South Australia in 1956. This aircraft dropped Britain's first hydrogen bomb at Christmas Island. Today, this is the only Valiant surviving anywhere in the world.
Washington, D.C., home to one of the most famous bombers of all time. This is the Enola Gay, which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. You either admire it or you despise it. It's on display at the Udvar-Hazy Museum, opened in 2003. Across the country in Dayton, Ohio, the United States Air Force Museum looks after a second B-29 named Bockscar, which dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. Was a large aircraft for its day, but by the 1950s, bombers were twice as big. This is the B-36 Peacemaker, and it never fired a shot in anger.
Six turning and four burning, 6 piston engines and 4 jet engines. The B-36 was the mainstay of Strategic Air Command in the 40s and 50s. It was so big that it had a tunnel linking the front of the aircraft to the rear, and the crew pulled themselves through it on a little wheeled trolley. Some plane.
One experimental version of the B-36 carried a fighter aircraft under its fuselage, which could be launched when the bomber was airborne. The Messerschmitt 262 lives again. In Germany, they stopped making them in 1945, but in Washington State, they're back in production. This is the fighter plane that could have changed the course of history. In this hangar on the same airfield as the mighty Boeing company, they're building replicas at a price.
Well, they're not cheap, okay? But compared to other airplanes, they're very unusual. We are asking $2.5 million for a flying airplane. Or if you'd prefer to have just a lawn ornament, we have a very nice static airplane for $650,000.
At the end of the war, only 2 countries had workable jets. The British had the Meteor and the Vampire, but the Germans had 39 jet aircraft, either flying or under development. The pick of the bunch was the 262, the Schwalbe, or Swallow. It was so fast that nothing could touch it. Unfortunately, it had been rushed into production before its jet engines had been tested. It wasn't a very reliable aircraft. "60 years later, they're building them again with modern jet engines. Four aircraft have so far been built. The first is now flying in Germany, and one is with a collector in California.
So we have substituted the General Electric J85, which is a much, much smaller engine. So we put the engine itself inside this, what we call the engine can. The General Electric J85 actually goes in it, and then to make sure that the airplane looks exactly the same, you have a long duct and the inlet and such with the Rydell starter, so it looks exactly like the original 262 with the UMOS 4 engine, but it is a very reliable engine for safety's sake.
The new engines are half the weight of the originals, but generate 1.5 times the power, so the replica Messerschmitts can, in theory, go much faster than the original. In its day, the 262 could reach speeds of 600 miles or 960 kilometres an hour, too fast for the Mustangs or Spitfires. If enough 262s had been built, they would have changed the course of the war. The new build 262s are perfect replicas, better built than the originals, which were largely put together by unskilled slave labourers working for the Nazis. This aircraft is destined for a museum. The swastika on the tail is covered over. It wouldn't be allowed if the plane was displayed in Germany. But the 262 couldn't stay in the air for very long. It had a very long takeoff run, terrible brakes, and an undercarriage that was prone to collapse in a heavy landing.
We don't push it. In fact, we don't take off at full power because of the airplane is the exact configuration, and the tail and rudder are not big enough to hold for VMC that speed for minimum control. If you were to lose an engine on takeoff, you wouldn't be able to control it. So we take off at partial throttle, and then as soon as we go past VMC, which is 150 knots, something like that, he goes to full power.
For anyone who's seriously interested in the aircraft of the Second World War, Duxford is required viewing. This isn't a place where you've just got a lot of aircraft gathering dust in the hangars. Most of them fly, something which they do on a regular basis.
People come a long way to see this aircraft, the Avro Vulcan. This is the only Vulcan still flying in the world. It's cost $30 million to put it back into the air, including a grant of $5 million from the British Heritage Lottery Fund. The Vulcan was a serious machine. Its shape alone was to strike fear into the opposition. But it never fired a shot in anger until the Falklands War, when it was just about to be retired from service. On the ground, Duxford has a fine collection of big passenger aircraft. The VC-10, the Bristol Britannia, and the Hawker Siddeley Trident. In the hangar there's a Concorde, this one the pre-production prototype. Only 20 Concordes were built. If you want to see one, they're mostly in museums. This one is at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. This one is at the Udvar-Hazy Center at Dulles Airport in Washington. And there are others in New York, Munich and Scotland. The Udvar-Hazy Museum has two other German types seen nowhere else. The Arado 234 Blitz, the world's first jet bomber, and the Dornier 335 Arrow. The Arado was mostly used as a reconnaissance aircraft. It was very fast, and piston-engine fighters had difficulty in catching it. Once again, it was a case of too little, too late, and very few Arados entered service in the Luftwaffe. The Dornier is perhaps one of the ugliest aircraft ever built, but it was very fast with two engines, one in the nose, one in the tail. It was also one of the first aircraft to be fitted with an ejection seat. Since the Second World War, passenger aircraft have steadily grown bigger. The latest, the massive Airbus A380, weighs 560 tons. But even this is dwarfed by an aircraft built more than 60 years ago. The Hughes Hercules, otherwise known as the Spruce Goose, is still the biggest aircraft ever built. Weighing 180 tons, with a wingspan of 320 feet or 97 metres. Powered by 8 enormous piston engines, it flew only once.
Hughes may have been regarded as an eccentric, but there's no doubt he was a brilliant aircraft engineer. Today, the Spruce Goose is still the biggest aircraft in the world, bigger than a Jumbo, bigger even than the new Airbus A380. And by the way, it's not the Spruce Goose, it's the Birch Goose. Wrong sort of wood. It's made of birch, not of spruce.
The Hughes Hercules now resides in McMinnville, Oregon, in a special climate-controlled hangar. The Hughes was built of wood because in wartime aluminium was in short supply. Take a look inside the fuselage and you'll see how all that wood was utilised. While the Hercules was designed to carry troops and materiel across the Atlantic, the North American Valkyrie had a more sinister purpose. Were built, one was lost in a spectacular mid-air collision.
There were two of those aircraft that were built. One was involved in a mid-air collision. There were 5 aircraft in the formation. All of them had General Electric engines. And one was an F-104 Starfighter, and there's an F-104 in the Cold War gallery. And that aircraft got too close to the B-70, and the tail of the B-70 gives you a vortex, okay? Well, the F-104 got caught up in that vortex and then did one of these numbers, sheared off the vertical stabilizer of the XB-70 and killed the 104 pilot instantly, and there were 2 guys in the XB-70, and one of those folks went down with the aircraft, and the other guy parachuted.
Then the US government decided there would be no more manned bombers and put their faith in missiles. The Valkyrie shares the hangar with other extraordinary research aircraft from the 50s and 60s. The Douglas X-3, known for obvious reasons as the Stiletto, and the rocket-powered North American X-15, which could do 6 times the speed of sound, 4,000 miles an hour at a height of 100 kilometers. John F. Kennedy's presidential 707 is here. It was in this plane that the president's body was flown back to Washington from Dallas. And in this room, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president. The shape of the future, the extraordinary and still most secret B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. 20 were built and they've seen service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each aircraft cost a staggering $730 million US. It can carry 80 smart bombs or nuclear weapons. The B-2 is a flying wing, but that concept is not new. Even in 1943, the Northrop Company produced the 9M, a flying wing with 2 pusher props. This was a scaled-down version of the B-35 bomber, and it was partially made of wood. In Seattle, the original Red Barn of the Boeing Company, and next door, the Museum of Flight. Getting into the air with pedal power, the Gossamer Albatross, which crossed the English Channel in 1979. This one also flew inside the Houston Astrodome. Is it a car or is it a plane? Actually, it's a bit of both. the Taylor Aero car could be driven on public roads or take to the air. At the rear was a Lycoming Aero engine. For transport, the wings folded flat, and it took about 15 minutes to convert it from ground to air. The Avro company in Canada experimented with a flying saucer, the Avro car. Its jet engines drive a circular turbo rotor, which produced thrust. It was supposed to float on a cushion of air like a hovercraft, but the company ran out of development money and it was not proceeded with. The star attraction at Udvar-Hazy is the Space Shuttle Enterprise. This was the first shuttle, but it never flew in space, instead being dropped from a 747 and gliding back to Earth. The first shuttle launch was in 1981. Since then, it has flown more than 120 times, but the shuttle program will come to an end in 2010.
From the Wright brothers to the space shuttle in a little more than 100 years. That's how far we've come. To me, the aeroplane is the most significant invention of the 20th century. And I hope in this program we've shown you some of the great aircraft, the milestones in a centenary of flight.